She used to taste the world. Now she tastes nothing. Then an impossible offer arrives, calm, precise, and dangerous. It does not promise a cure. It promises a reckoning, truth poured straight into the senses. There is a price. There are no guarantees. The change comes all at once. One choice, one surrender that will remake how she feels forever. Listen, the confession begins from the Curator's collection, The Sommelier's Confession.
Part 1. The Invitation. The silence in the ballroom was a physical weight, a pressure against the skin. Genevieve stood on the brightly lit stage, the heat of the lamps like a sterile sun. Before her, on a stark white tablecloth, sat a single glass of deep red wine. The moderator's voice, amplified and intimate, announced its identity. A 1999 Domaine de la Romanée Conti La Tâche, a legend. A hushed, reverent awe settled over the hundreds of dark figures in the audience. Genevieve began her process, her movements a ballet of perfect, practiced economy. She swirled the wine, her wrist making a flawless circle, watching the viscous legs cling to the crystal. She lifted the glass to her nose, tilted her head, and closed her eyes, her face a mask of serene concentration. A dominant nose of wild cherry, she began, her voice calm, authoritative, a familiar instrument playing a familiar score. Giving way to Saubois, that beautiful scent of a damp forest floor. A tertiary hint of clove, star anise, and a very subtle, almost ghostly smokiness. The words were beautiful, precise, and a complete fabrication. A lie constructed from 2 decades of study, from textbooks and memory and tasting notes written by other people in other times when the world still had flavor. As she spoke, a memory flash cut through her concentration, sharp and violent. The sound in her head was not the polite cough of the audience, but the high-pitched, tearing screech of tires on wet asphalt. The image behind her eyes was not the deep ruby of the wine, but the terrifying, spider-webbing cracks of a shattering windshield. A name, Louis, was a silent scream in her mind, a taste of blood and despair she could never wash away. She blinked, returning to the stage. The audience was rapt. She brought the glass to her lips. She sipped, letting the legendary liquid coat her tongue, praying for a miracle. There was nothing, only texture, a faint, disappointing viscosity, and temperature. The flavor was ash. Her entire inner world, once a vibrant cathedral of sensation, was now a ruin of gray, tasteless dust. She swallowed, her expression unchanged. She delivered her final assessment of the palate, another beautiful lie about phantom fruits and ethereal tannins, technically flawless and emotionally void. The judges, 2 old men with owlish glasses, nodded in deep, solemn agreement. The applause began, a hollow, distant sound, like stones rattling in a tin can, a confirmation of a victory that felt like a profound and absolute defeat. Genevieve's apartment was minimalist, eerily clean, and silent. It was the home of a woman who had banished the joy of food and wine, a space scrubbed clean of life. She stood at the counter, polishing a Zalto burgundy glass she would never use, the ritual a form of self-flagellation. A courier's package sat beside the sink. She didn't remember ordering anything. She opened it cautiously. Inside, nestled in dark, fragrant straw, was a single bottle of wine. It was unlabeled, its shape ancient, heavy, a pre-phylloxera Bordeaux. Her historian's mind, the part of her that still functioned, recognized the form. She examined the cork. It was sealed with brittle black wax. After carefully cracking it, her breath caught. A vintage was crudely etched by hand into the cork itself. 1868, Chateau Latour. Impossible. The records were unequivocal. The entire Latour estate, including its cellars, had burned to the ground in the Great Fire of winter 1867. This bottle, this specific history, should not exist. Her professional curiosity, a muscle long dormant, twitched with life. Her apathy began to give way to a cautious, dangerous intrigue. She found her best corkscrew, the loguole that Louis had given her. The pop of the ancient cork was shockingly loud in the silent room. She poured a small measure into the glass she had just polished. She lifted it to her nose, expecting the usual void, the familiar gray nothingness. And then, a miracle. A faint, ghostly aroma cut through the sensory fog. It was real, not a memory, not an intellectual construct. It was the complex, layered scent of smoke, of crushed violets, and of damp earth after a cooling rain. It was the most beautiful thing she had smelled in a year. Her hand trembled. She brought the glass to her lips and tasted. The flavor was still muted, a distant echo, like hearing a symphony from across a vast empty square. But the promise of flavor was there, a spark of life in a dead world. Her eyes filled with tears, hot and real. She looked at the impossible cork she had set aside on the counter. Tied to it with a simple black silk ribbon was a small, rigid card. The labyrinthine crest was embossed on its surface. The words were printed beneath. The palate is not a tool. It is a soul. Below that, an address in Bordeaux. The initial euphoria gave way to a cold wave of rational suspicion. A trick. A cruel, elaborate prank. She was a scientist of the senses. She did not believe in miracles. Furious at herself for her moment of hope, she moved to pour the impossible wine down the drain, to banish the ghost. But she couldn't. She left the glass on the counter, an accusation in the silent apartment. The next day was another purgatory of professional tasting, of smiling and nodding and articulating flavors that existed only in her memory. She returned home, exhausted by the performance. The apartment was still and gray. The single glass of the mysterious Bordeaux was sitting where she had left it. She picked it up, expecting the scent to be gone, a figment of her imagination now faded. But it was still there, perhaps even more potent, more complex. The hope she had tried to kill returned with agonizing force. Her meticulous historian's mind took over. For 2 days, she barely slept. She pulled up the archival records of the 1877 Latour fire, confirming its total destruction. She researched the address from the card, a real, respected, but very old vintner's shop in the Chartrons district. She searched for the labyrinthine crest online, through heraldry databases and occult forums. Nothing. The impossible logicality of the bottle clashed with the undeniable physical evidence in her glass. It was a war between her life's training and the desperate, irrational hope of her senses. On the third day, she reached her breaking point. She caught her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop, a pale, haunted woman, a ghost in her own life. She realized then that even if it was a trick, it was the only thing that had made her feel anything. The risk of being fooled was less terrifying than the certainty of her current tasteless existence. With the grim resolve of a patient agreeing to a dangerous experimental surgery, she booked the flight. Clutching the impossible cork like a holy relic, she flew to the city that had been the site of her greatest triumphs, and now felt like a ghost town. She found the address in an old, quiet quarter famous for its antique wine merchants. It was an unassuming shop, its windows dusty, smelling of old wood and sawdust. Inside, a severe-looking elderly man sat behind a counter, not speaking. He watched her approach with eyes that seemed to have seen every vintage, every triumph, and every failure.
Genevieve wordlessly placed the 1868 cork on the counter between them. He looked down at it, then back up at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. Without a word, the proprietor rose and gestured for her to follow. He led her past the dusty shelves of modern vintages, through a heavy oak door in the back, and to a winding stone staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew cooler, damper. The smell was intoxicating, a scent she inhaled with desperate lungs. Rich soil, cellar mold, and the ghosts of 1,000 ancient sleeping wines. The stairs opened into a vast, candle-lit cellar, the bottles resting in their bins like coffins in a catacomb. A voice spoke from the deep shadows between the wine racks. It was smooth, genderless, calm as still water. "Genevieve, we have been waiting for you." The voice knew her name. It spoke of her condition as a sensory amputation, of her lies on the stage, her private grief. It did not offer a cure. It offered a demolition. "We will not give you back what you lost," the voice said, the name Lewis a perfectly placed stiletto in the dark. "That is gone. We will build you something new. But first, the palette must be unmade." The voice then detailed the price: absolute sensory surrender. She would be blindfolded. She would be bound. She would be subjected to sensations, some pleasant, some painful, all extreme. She would have no control, no knowledge of what comes next, no safe word. A cold, primal fear seized her. Her body tensed. This was not a tasting. It was an interrogation, a violation. Her mind screamed at her to run, to flee back to the gray safety of her life. The thought of being helpless, of being touched and manipulated in the dark by strangers, was abhorrent. She took a half step backward, her hand balling into a fist. The voice spoke one last time, softly, without inflection. "What is the alternative, Genevieve? A lifetime of ash." The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. She thought of the lie on stage, the silent apartment, the endless future of tasting nothing. The terror of the known suddenly, catastrophically, outweighed the terror of the unknown. Her fear did not vanish, but her desperation became greater than her fear. She stopped, straightened her back, and met the darkness where the voice resided. "I agree," she said. The words were not eager. They were the grim, resolute last words of her old self. Part 2. The exhibition. A presence shifted in the darkness before her. Genevieve only registered it by the faintest displacement of the cool, damp air and a new scent, clean and neutral, like cool stone. A silent figure, the cellar. A hand, its touch impersonal and steady, lifted a heavy weight. She flinched as fabric touched her forehead, but held herself still, a silent act of compliance. A black velvet blindfold was tied securely over her eyes. Her world, already muted, shrank further, collapsing into a universe of darkness. The sound of her own frantic breathing, the damp scent of the cellar, and the cool air on her skin. She was an instrument, waiting to be played. After a long, disorienting silence, designed to strip away her sense of time, she felt the cool, smooth rim of a small spoon touch her lips. She instinctively opened them. A single drop of liquid was placed on her tongue. It was water. Her first reaction was disappointment, an internal scoff. Water? But she was trapped here, a captive audience. She forced herself to do what she did best, to analyze. She let the single drop coat her tongue, holding it, dissecting it. It was not neutral. There was a distinct mineral character, a stony flavor she recognized as limestone. It was hard water, heavy, with a texture that was almost, but not quite, oily. It tasted ancient, patient. It was the taste of the very ground beneath her feet. It was not a beverage, it was a lesson. Pay attention, it seemed to say. The universe is in everything, if you are humble enough to look. Another silence, longer this time. She focused on the lingering mineral taste, her mind already working, trying to anticipate. The spoon touched her lips again. This time, a tiny amount of a gritty substance. Her tongue recoiled on instinct. Soil. It was damp, loamy, and shockingly potent. For a moment, she was overwhelmed by disgust, by the sheer indignity of it. She, who had judged the rarest wines on earth, was being force-fed dirt? But beneath the humiliation, a deeper sense of the flavor began to emerge. It was not just dirt. It was the taste of life and decay, of truffle and mushroom, of everything that grows and everything that dies. It was the taste of the sous-bois she had lied about on stage. But this was the raw, brutal truth of it, not the poetic abstraction. It was the taste of terroir itself, a flavor she had described 1,000 times, but never truly understood until this moment of violation. The third taste was an assault. A single, intensely sour, unripe grape was placed in her mouth. She was compelled to crush it. The acidity was a physical pain, a violent, electrifying jolt that seized her jaw and made her eyes water fiercely beneath the blindfold. Her whole body clenched against the attack. The flavor was pure, concentrated malic acid, green and sharp and hateful. It was the taste of potential unrealized, of a life cut short before ripeness. It tasted like her own grief. And in that agony, a thought bloomed, terrifying and liberating. She was feeling this. The pain was real, a bright, sharp color in her world of gray. It was infinitely better than the taste of ash. The cellar returned. Genevieve tensed, her mouth still aching from the acidic grape. Instead of another taste, she felt a rough texture being drawn slowly across the bare skin of her forearm. It was coarse, like burlap, each fiber a tiny abrasive point against her sensitive skin. As the sensation traveled up her arm, a dropper touched her lips, depositing a young, tannic red wine. The taste was aggressive and raspy, the tannins gripping her gums, unfinished and raw. Her mind, unbidden, made an instantaneous connection. The rough, scraping feeling on her arm was the harsh, gripping tannin in her mouth. They were not two separate sensations. They were one. Her arm was released. A moment later, a length of cool, unbelievably smooth silk was traced down her other arm. The sensation was exquisite, a cascade of pure, frictionless pleasure. As it glided over her skin, a drop of perfectly aged, buttery, golden Chardonnay touched her tongue. The pairing was a revelation. The wine's famous malolactic creaminess was no longer just a taste. It was the liquid form of the silk she felt on her skin. Her mind, being forcibly rewired, grasped the new language. Touch was taste. Texture was flavor. She felt something loop around her left wrist. Soft leather. Another loop around her right. The straps were gently but firmly secured to the arms of the heavy oak chair. The feeling of being bound, of her movement being restricted, was a sharp, clarifying sensory input. It was not painful, but it was absolute. It focused her, stripping away all distraction. With her wrists now bound, a new wine was introduced. It was a famously closed Bordeaux, a tight fist of a wine. At first, she tasted almost nothing, just that unyielding wall of tannin. But the constant, gentle pressure of the leather straps on her wrists acted as a key. She focused on the feeling of being held, of being restrained, and used that focus to push against the closed facade of the wine. She probed it with her full attention, and for a moment, behind that wall, she tasted something extraordinary. A flicker of blackcurrant, a hint of cedar, a ghost of violet, all hidden deep inside, waiting to be released. She was left alone again, blindfolded and bound. The initial fear, the disgust, had been burned away. All that remained was a desperate, almost feverish anticipation. She was no longer fighting the process. She craved the next sensation, the next piece of the puzzle. She strained against the leather straps, not to escape, but to feel that tension again, to try and unlock the flavor on her tongue. She needed to know what was behind that door. The cellier returned. The voice was quiet this time, close to her ear, intimate and terrifying. "Tell us how the flavor died, Genevieve." She shook her head, a silent, defiant no, her body rigid in the chair. The attendant placed a single drop of a liquid on her tongue. The taste was singular, unlike anything she had ever known. It was intensely, agonizingly bitter, a pure chemical concentration of grief. It was unbearable. A flavor that seemed to suck all other sensation from the world, leaving only a pinpoint of black, searing agony. "The truth is a required ingredient," the voice insisted softly. "Confess and receive the pairing." The bitterness on her tongue bloomed, becoming more intense, a physical pain that spread down her throat. The only escape was to speak. "No," she gasped, but the word was weak. The bitterness was absolute. "We were driving back from dinner," she finally choked out, the words ripped from her. "It was raining." The confession, once started, poured out of her, raw and unfiltered. She told them about the argument with Louis, something stupid about money, about work. She confessed her guilt, that she was the one driving, that she had looked away from the road for just a second. The memory, locked away for a year, was finally uncorked. the truth spilling into the dark cellar. As she spoke, as the tears she could no longer suppress streamed from under her blindfold and traced hot paths down her cheeks, a miracle happened on her tongue. The bitterness began to change. It did not vanish, but transformed. She tasted salt, the undeniable sharp salt of her own tears. She tasted iron, the phantom, metallic tang of blood from her memory. And then, as the last of the poison was spoken, as she whispered the final, terrible truth of the silence after the crash, a new flavor emerged from within the bitterness, a gentle, heartbreaking sweetness, a flavor of release, of a terrible, painful acceptance. She was tasting her own confession, a vintage of pure, unadulterated soul. Part 3. The Unveiling. The soft leather slid away from her wrists. The sudden freedom of her hands was a new and powerful sensation, a release so profound it was almost a taste in itself. She flexed her fingers, feeling the blood rush back into them. After a long moment that stretched into an eternity, she felt the cellarier's hands at the back of her head. They moved with an impersonal grace as they gently untied the knot of the blindfold. Light flooded her senses, a soft, warm deluge. She blinked against it, her pupils contracting painfully. When her vision cleared, the cellar was changed. It was no longer a place of interrogation, but a sanctum lit by dozens of flickering candles that made the shadows dance. Before her, on a small, solitary table of dark, polished wood, stood a single, perfect crystal glass. It contained a shimmering, ruby-colored liquid, the wine from the impossible 1868 vintage. The attendant gave a single, commanding nod. "Drink." Genevieve reached for the glass, her hand perfectly steady. As she lifted it, the aroma rose to meet her, and it was not a scent, but a story. It was an explosive, overwhelming universe she now perceived with impossible clarity. It was not just smoke and violets anymore. Woven into its very fabric, she could smell the memory of the damp, loamy soil, the sharp green tang of the unripe grape, and beneath it all, the phantom scent of her own salty tears. It was the aroma of the entire exhibition, contained in a single glass. Her lips touched the cool rim. She sipped. The flavor detonated. It was not a sensation confined to her mouth. It was a full-body, synesthetic explosion. She didn't just taste cherry and earth. She felt the memory of the smooth silk gliding across her skin in the wine's flawless texture. She felt the pleasant structural tension of the tannins, like the ghost of the leather straps on her wrists, a feeling of being perfectly held together. She tasted the deep, foundational bitterness of her own confession, a flavor that was no longer agonizing, but provided a profound, resonant bass note. And blooming from that bitterness was the sweet, heartbreaking flavor of her release. It was the most complex and beautiful thing she had ever experienced. She lowered the glass, her breath catching in her throat. She understood with a sudden breathtaking clarity. Her old palate, the one that could identify a wine's region and vintage with cold precision, was a crude tool, a child's toy. This new sense was something else entirely. It was not just an organ of taste, it was an organ of truth, capable of discerning the emotional and textural history of everything it touched. Her old palate had not been restored. It had been destroyed and replaced by something infinitely more powerful. Next to the now empty glass lay a single black card, a note from the Curator. It was not a congratulation, but an artist's critique written in an elegant, incisive script. An extraordinary vintage. The confession provided a remarkable structure. The initial notes of grief were unflinching, with a bitterness of exceptional purity. The finish, however, showed a remarkable clarity and sweetness. A successful transformation. The note concluded with a professional proposition, a choice. She could leave now. She could take her new transcendent palette back into the muted, tasteless world, a goddess of sensation capable of perceiving truths no one else could even imagine. She would be free, but forever marked by the depth of her new perception, a solitary queen in a kingdom of ash. Or she could stay. She could become the Curator's permanent sommelier. Her new role would be to design these sensory rituals, to pair pain with revelation, to select the catalysts, the earth, the silk, the precise degree of bitterness that would uncork the confessions of others. She would be an artist, harvesting the souls of others to create new, impossible flavors for the Curator's ever-growing collection. Genevieve stared down at her own distorted reflection in the deep red dregs of the wine in her glass. She saw a new face there, one that was no longer haunted by grief, but was imbued with a terrifying, calm power. She thought of the gray world outside, of the polite lies and the flavor of dust. Then she thought of the symphony she now held within her. Slowly, she raised the glass to her lips again, not to drink, but to inhale the last fading vestiges of the aroma, the scent of her own remade soul. Her expression was unreadable, a complex blend of awe and a dark, burgeoning ambition. The choice of whether she would become a master of this art or merely its most sensitive victim hung in the cool, silent air of the cellar.
Thank you for lingering with the Sommelier's Confession from the Curator's collection. If the echoes moved you, subscribe for more quiet discoveries. Tap Watch Next. More whispers from the collection await.